The estate sale listing was almost an afterthought, one line buried in a local classifieds group. Contents of deceased woodworker's shop, 40-plus years of tools, everything must go this weekend. No photos, no inventory, just an address and a time. Most people scrolled right past it. I didn't. I drove out that Saturday morning not knowing what I'd find. What greeted me, once the garage door rolled up, wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a small hobby shed with a few dusty tools. It was a full workshop, floor to ceiling, that had clearly belonged to someone who'd spent 4 decades building things with his hands. Hundreds of tools, some still in their original boxes, some worn smooth from a lifetime of use. All of it sitting untouched since the man who owned it had passed. His daughter, who was running the sale, told me he'd built furniture out of that garage since the 70s. Everything from simple shelves to full dining sets, most of it given away to family and neighbors rather than sold. He never threw anything away, she said, gesturing at the walls. If you can figure out what actually matters in here, take whatever you need. That single sentence turned the whole afternoon into something more than shopping. It became a real question worth answering. Out of hundreds of tools in that garage, which ones actually mattered? Which ones had this man reached for on every single project? And which ones had sat in a drawer, bought once, used never? Because here's the truth, almost nobody starting out in woodworking gets told plainly. You do not need 100 tools to build real furniture. You need about a dozen, used correctly, and everything else is just clutter taking up bench space. So I spent the next 3 hours going drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, separating what mattered from what didn't. And what I found lines up almost exactly with what the tested plans in a library like tedswoodworking actually call for, project after project. Here's exactly what earned its place on that short list, and why. The first drawer I opened told me everything about how this man actually worked. It wasn't full of power tools. It was full of pry bars, 4 of them, different lengths, all worn smooth on the flat end from years of prying boards apart. A flat pry bar is genuinely the first tool anyone working with reclaimed pallet wood needs, because it's what separates boards from a pallet frame without splitting the wood the way a hammer alone almost always does. His daughter mentioned he always kept at least 2 on the bench, one for the initial gap, a second, thinner one for finishing the separation once the first had done the heavy work. That's a real technique, not a guess, and it explained why 4 sat in that drawer instead of 1. Right next to the pry bars sat something almost every beginner skips buying, and it turned out to be one of the most used tools in the entire shop based on how worn the handle was, a rubber mallet. Not a hammer, a mallet with a soft rubber head. You use it to tap a pry bar under a stubborn board without denting or splitting the wood the way a steel hammer would. Cheap, almost never mentioned in beginner guides, and clearly one of his most reached for tools based on wear alone. The next section of the shop told a different story, a wall of measuring tools, and this is where I started understanding exactly how someone builds furniture that actually holds together for decades instead of wobbling apart in a year. A tape measure, obviously, but next to it, mounted on a nail, a combination square, a simple L-shaped tool that checks whether a corner is a true 90 degrees before you ever drive a screw into it. His daughter told me he used to say a project built on a slightly off angle just gets more wrong with every board you add, which is exactly right. A tiny error at the first joint compounds into a serious problem by the 10th. Underneath the workbench, in a drawer that had clearly been opened thousands of times based on how worn the handle was, sat his clamps, 6 of them, different sizes, ranging from small hand clamps to 2 long bar clamps nearly 3 feet across. Clamps hold pieces together while glue cures, and here's something that surprised me looking at his notes taped inside the drawer. He'd written, "Always 2 more than you think you need," on a scrap of paper stuck to the inside wall. Ask almost any experienced woodworker, and they'll tell you the same thing. Beginners consistently underestimate how many clamps a single joint actually needs to hold true while glue sets. Then came the drill, an old corded model, definitely older than some of the sanders sitting nearby, but clearly his most used power tool in the entire shop based on the worn grip and the collection of driver bits scattered in the tray beside it. A drill driver does 2 jobs that matter enormously for reclaimed wood furniture. drilling pilot holes before driving a screw, which prevents the wood from splitting the way it will if you drive a screw straight into pallet wood without one, and then actually driving that screw home. His daughter mentioned he almost never used nails for furniture. Screws, she said, because Dad always said nails work themselves loose and screws don't. That's not folklore. That's decades of real experience talking, and it lines up exactly with what every serious woodworking plan recommends today. The last section I went through was the safety gear, tucked on a shelf by the door, and this is the part that made me stop and actually think for a second. A pair of safety glasses, worn and scratched from real use, and a small box of dust masks, half empty. Nothing fancy, but every single project in that garage had been built by a man who protected his eyes and lungs every time he picked up a saw, for 40 straight years, without exception. That's worth remembering before you ever touch a power tool yourself. By the time I'd gone through the whole shop, the actual list of tools that mattered, the ones worn smooth from real use, the ones his daughter confirmed he reached for on nearly every project, came down to about a dozen items. A pry bar, a rubber mallet, a tape measure and combination square, several clamps, a drill driver with pilot bits, sandpaper and a few grits, wood glue, safety glasses and a dust mask, a basic hand saw or circular saw for cutting boards to length. That's it. Everything else in that garage, and there was a lot else, had barely been touched. Here's what that afternoon actually taught me, and it's worth sitting with if you've ever felt like you couldn't start woodworking because you didn't have a real workshop full of expensive equipment. You don't need most of what's sold to beginners as essential. You need about a dozen honest, well-used tools and the actual knowledge of how to use each one correctly. The same dozen tools that sat worn smooth in that garage after 40 years of real building. That second part, the actual knowledge, is exactly where most people get stuck, even once they've got the right tools sitting on a bench. Owning a pry bar doesn't tell you where to position it. Owning clamps doesn't tell you how many a specific joint actually needs. That's the real gap between a pile of tools and a finished piece of furniture, and it's exactly why I use Ted's Woodworking myself. A library of over 16,000 tested plans that tell you exactly which tools each project needs and exactly how to use them. The same kind of hard-won knowledge that man built up over 4 decades in that garage, already written down so you don't have to learn it the same slow way he did. I left that estate sale with a truck bed full of tools that afternoon. The dozen that mattered, nothing more. And every time I use one of them now, I think about a man I never met, who spent 40 years quietly figuring out exactly what actually works, and left it all behind in a garage for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. If you're just getting started and wondering what you actually need before your first project, the plans linked in the description tell you exactly that, tool by tool, project by project, so you're not left guessing the way most beginners are. Sometimes the best education isn't a course. It's an old garage, a patient daughter, and 40 years of somebody else's mistakes already worked out for you.